history is not predetermined. It's not inevitable. The people who were doing it and living through it did not know the future, they did not look at it from the same perspective that we have looking back on it. And at the same time, there are, as you said, sort of certain patterns and, things that can be learned, mistakes that were made, that we can say, oh, we wish, things that we wish hadn't have happened, but did.
Hello, Inquirers. A quick note before today's episode. There are two great conferences coming up in Ontario, Canada in the next couple of months. The first is the World Humanist Congress in Ottawa, Ontario from August 7th to 9th. It's going to be a gathering of humanists from around the globe. I think about 50 countries are going to be represented there. There's going to be 500 or 600 delegates. Tickets are selling fast. It's going to be fabulous. If you are there, please find me. I will be there. Say hello. CFIC will have a table in the Nova Scotia room. So drop by, say hello to myself or one of our volunteers. Look forward to seeing you there. 2 weeks later, August 21st to 23rd in Sarnia, Ontario, there's BajaCon. I've been to BajaCon all 4 previous occasions. Unfortunately, I won't be able to make it this year, but if you do go, say hello to all of my friends there. It's going to be a fabulous conference. Sarnia, August 21st to 23rd. Links are in the show notes. And now, on to today's episode. Lizzie Wade is my guest today on Podcast for Inquiry. Lizzie is the author of Apocalypse: How Catastrophe Transformed Our World and Can Forge New Futures. She is a science writer focusing on archaeology and anthropology, a contributing correspondent for Science, and her work has also appeared in Wired, Archaeology, National Geographic, and Slate. You can follow her work by subscribing to the Antiquarian newsletter at theantiquarian.email. We start our conversation talking about how ancient Egypt, which was very hierarchical and funneled lots of resources to its ruling class, collapsed when a prolonged drought struck. Lizzie explains how the Mayan civilization still existed when it was first contacted by the Spanish, despite the centralized state dissolving centuries earlier. I ask whether there are grand themes in the study of history, or if it's just one damn thing after another. According to Lizzie, contemporary society is facing its own apocalypse, but there are options available to us to address it. I am very happy to bring you my conversation with Lizzie Wade on today's Podcast for Inquiry. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Lizzie Wade, welcome to Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I wanted to talk to you today about your book. It's called Apocalypse, and I've read it, and your subtitle is How Catastrophe Transformed Our World and Can Forge New Futures. Now, my first question for you is, are you okay? You did a tremendous. I know because I read your book. You've done a tremendous amount of research about how successful, complex societies collapsed and the enormous toll that it wrought, and what came out of that. You give several examples, and I want to talk about a few of them. But that must have taken an enormous toll. So my first question is, how are you doing?
I'm okay, actually. I think I did do a lot of research for this book, but I think actually sort of being able to look at what has happened in the past, and obviously I was always thinking about how it's connected to now, although of course I don't ever want past societies to just be kind of like parables of like 5 lessons we can learn from the Black Death or whatever. Like I wanted to, they were their own complex worlds, and I want to understand them on their own terms, and I want to understand our world on its own terms. But actually, sort of being able to dive in really deeply to these stories, and also kind of admit that what's happening now at the time that we're entering is really scary and potentially uh, very bad for many of us, but also has incredible potential for transformation and really new ideas, new ways of organizing society. Like I wouldn't say I came out of this book more optimistic exactly, and I'm not sure I would call
Mhm.
the book itself, like, I don't really like these kind of binary, like, optimistic or pessimistic terms, but I did sort of in a time that's and I think probably similar to times in the past, that's characterized by a lot of denial and just not wanting to think about it too hard, like actually being able to think about it hard and looking at it straight on and figuring out what I actually thought was happening was sort of a relief, I would say.
Okay, well let's keep the focus contemporary at least for now, and because you're saying that we are literally speaking in apocalyptic terms, and you just used the present tense for that, and certainly, like, if we just look at the 20th century, we had World Wars One and Two, we had the Holocaust, we had the Armenian genocide, we had the Great Depression, we had any number of other wars and crises. Um, so it's not as though we are strangers to bad events, uh, but I'm not sure that using the term apocalypse would necessarily be appropriate for anything from the last, say, 100 years. What makes you think that what we're facing now is worthy of the term apocalypse? Because it's I mean, it's a big, and I don't want to cheapen the what apocalypse means by saying just because we may be facing some tough times, just because there are places that are war, just because there are. I mean, and I don't want to demean the fact that there are people dying in the world. That is true, but that doesn't on its own necessarily warrant a description of apocalypse. So
Mhm.
why do you fear, or perhaps even believe, that the apocalypse is nigh?
Well, I'd say an apocalypse maybe, and I think how I define it in the book, if I can remember, is um, something like a rapid collective loss that quickly transforms a society's way of life or sense of identity. And I think the key word there is like really transformation. Like, and I'm not, I will say I'm not totally sure that we can define an apocalypse before or even as it's happening, which is something interesting I learned in the book. I'm
Mhm.
not sure that people who live through them really know when they start, know when they've ended, would necessarily always define what they've been through as an apocalypse. But once you get to the other side and there's that society sort of reorganizes itself, or better said, the people in the society who have gone through this event kind of figure out how to reorganize themselves in response. Um, I think, and I think what makes our time, at least in a potential apocalypse, is certainly, climate change is mostly what I was thinking about when I started the book. I wrote the book during the COVID pandemic, largely, really in high quarantine for most of it, and that certainly felt apocalyptic at the time. I would say at this point, it doesn't seem like maybe COVID has transformed our society that much. But I also think looking at these events on kind of an archaeological timescale of decades or even centuries, it also sort of gave me the sense that, we will never know really what COVID did to us and our societies, like the people who lived through it. Like, it will take a long time for that story to fully play out. And um, so I think, part of what I think makes a transformation more likely is sort of the interconnectedness of a world that experiences a catastrophe like this, um, like a sense that these events will repeat and kind of compound on themselves, like when you don't really know when the next wave will hit you, or like the next kind of piece of the story will arrive. And I think all of that kind of extended uncertainty hitting kind of an interconnected society, like, and our society is probably the most interconnected the world has ever been. I think we the world most the world has been globalized for a long time, and I think there's very interesting, that often gets kind of overlooked in the past, that kind of interconnection and diversity, even across distances that are vast to us today. But I think it's fair to say we're the most interconnected and globalized the human race has ever been. And I think like that, it both sort of makes us more vulnerable to these apocalyptic events, but also increases the chance that we could really transform out of them, because there's sort of no where to go that is unaffected, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and one of the things that struck me about your book was you don't shy away from the loss and the damage being done through societies experiencing collapse for various reasons. But as you just said, there was almost a hopeful note, uh, a thread throughout the book, because although the society in the form that it was, and you give several examples in Apocalypse, does not survive in the same form. There, the people survive, or at least not everyone dies. There are a significant number, and they reform a new society, taking what or maintaining what still did work, and broadly speaking, discarding what did not, and figuring out new ways to feed themselves, new ways to structure their politics, how they make decisions as a society, what social institutions they will reform, and which social institutions they discard, and what new ones to build in their place. So can you give sort of an overview of that process, and what it was like for? And I'll let you choose an example, because there are a few in your book.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, for particularly an apocalypse hitting kind of an established, complex society, I really loved the example of Old Kingdom Egypt, which is sort of the earliest like period of what we think of as ancient Egypt, although it would again sort of regenerate and reform and go on to exist for
Hmm.
thousands more years. But I think what apocalypses can do, and really where their transformative potential comes from, is that these kind of uh, catastrophes that nobody can really predict or control, especially in the past, hit a society, like it kind of hits a society at its weak points. And I think we sort of intuitively experienced that with COVID, right? Like it was sort of like this kind of this sort of global um, consumerist like world organization kind of revealed itself to sort of collapse under the slightest disruption. I mean, it wasn't a slight disruption, but like, instant, within 24 hours, it was like, is the whole way we've like organized the world going to be able to survive this? So it hits these events kind of hit as society's weak points. And
Hmm.
oftentimes, although not always, that weak point is sort of entrenched hierarchies and intense inequality, which is certainly what the Old Kingdom Egypt was based around. You had this sort of divine king figure controlling everything, the whole, like a tremendous amount of even kind of the economy of the nation was directed towards preserving his ability to protect and guide Egypt even into the afterlife. This was, of course, the pyramids of Giza are the most iconic example, probably now and probably even then, of this sort of investment in this hierarchy. This doesn't mean that like there was no um, it was all coercion, like it feels good to be a part of something. It feels good to sort of know your role in a larger process. Like, I think probably some people chafed against this. There wasn't a lot of, if you were a farmer in a village, that was who you were. Like, it wasn't, you're not going to become, your life wasn't going to become something different than when you were born, or who your family had been for generations. And so there wasn't a lot of flexibility. That's not, yeah, again, that's not to say I think it was entirely coercive or kind of like unpleasant for everyone all the time, but it
Hmm.
certainly was, the whole society. It was very top heavy. Like, the king controlled everything. The king's desire was like that was what everybody worked towards, directed their lives towards, directed their work towards. And kind of when a complex society collapses, in this case, it's sort of the collapse, I wouldn't say was caused by, but a very intense dry period happened in many parts of the world around 4,200 years ago, kind of collided with a time when this kind of hierarchical top-down control of Egypt was already kind of fracturing and showing its weak links. Like, people, like local governors were like becoming more like wanting more power. Like, it was all just kind of like on the verge, and then this dry period just like got worse and worse and worse, and the country eventually collapsed, which basically means it like disintegrated. So like different provinces said, we're doing our own thing now, we have our own leader. There was still a king, but he didn't have control over the region, the region it his predecessors had governed. There was all this kind of like ideology about balance, and the south of the country produced all this grain, and the north of the country did the herding, and like how everything was kind of like interconnected was seems to have been lost. But also the kind of accounts we have of this event really come from, there is one especially quite famous written account of the collapse of Old Kingdom Egypt, probably. I mean, the first surviving copy is from much later, as these things often are, but there's good reason to believe that the person who wrote the original did sort of experience some of this collapse. And he talks about it in truly like apocalyptic terms, like,
Hmm.
uh the Nile being like choked with dead bodies, and people like fleeing their towns, and civil war taking over. And when the archaeology of kind of regular people's lives doesn't always match the kind of like tenor of that fear and that like that experience. And I think it's important to consider that a lot of the time when we're um, talking about societal collapse, like the perspective we have absorbed and like that we sort of intuitively find the most interesting is the perspective of the elites, who often do quite suffer when the structures that gave them a lot of power are disintegrating out from under them. I mean, it's a terrifying experience. And but that doesn't mean that that's everybody's experienced throughout
Hmm.
a society. And so I think a lot of people sort of, all of these like different art styles start popping up all over the place. There's like the tombs outside of, for a long time archaeologists were like, oh my god, we find so many more tombs in this first intermediate period, is called, and it's like so many more people must have been dying. But another way to look at that is like the tombs are better quality, so they survive for the archaeologists to find them. And it's like, so more people had access to this like very important kind of like culture really changed to expand the access to
Right.
kind of this eternal afterlife. And so it's just like, you change the perspective a little bit on these
Yeah.
events.
Or
You're
more
like,
people are entombed rather than just
yeah,
buried,
like buried in a pit, who like
right? Without
never really
necessarily
again.
changing the number of people that are dying
Exactly.
on a, in a
Yeah.
given year or
Yeah.
era.
So it's like, it's not to say that these that there weren't some like horrible years, or that these experiences that are recorded in the text are not real, like, or these people didn't go through them. But it's just sort of saying, okay, whose perspective have we, is it the easiest to see here, and who have we been missing, and what does it look the same if we expand our view a little bit? And oftentimes it looks really different. Like and that also I found somewhat hopeful, like
Mhm.
like these events and experiences are not monolithic. And um there is a lot of, yeah, there's just like a lot of opportunity for things that seemed impossible before, because the apocalypses really do sort of expose, as you said, like what's not working, like, and give you a chance to say, okay, do we want to keep going with this thing that has obviously failed us, or how are we going to change to make it work better, for not better in like sort of a um, objectively, like forever, this society is the one that will last forever. Like that will never happen. There will always be a challenge. There'll always be changes. But,
Mhm.
like, do we want to continue with the structures and the expectations and the hierarchies that sort of got us into this mess? And a lot of time people say, actually, let's not do that anymore. And I think that's a very powerful reaction, I think.
So, I mean, it kind of makes sense then. If we take a very broad and I'm being a deliberately naive view for the moment. Okay, so we had ancient Egypt kingdoms rise, and farmers got the benefit where they could just farm, but because and they're in the south. But if they only farm, they will have no meat because they're not herding. But if we specialize in the north, then the farmers the farmers can have the benefit of their efforts, but also the benefit of the herders' efforts in the north. And with a centralized kingdom, they don't have to worry about being invaded by another country. If there's an administrative state, they don't have to worry about their neighboring farmers sort of stealing their land. There's some, and it allows me as a farmer just to farm and still get the benefits of lots of other. So I can see how this system might arise, right? And then there's a collapse, and all these hierarchies collapse, and we realize, oh, maybe that wasn't such a great idea, and there's all these tensions. So why did we do that again and again and again? I mean, in some cases, it may have arisen independently in different areas, but in other cases, uh, these hierarchical, centralized states did arise in the same place in a very similar form. Are we just incapable of learning? Are we, as a species, I mean, do we not learn from history? Are the reasons that I outlined that these states centralized and became hierarchical in the first place, are those such compelling advantages that we keep wanting to go to that? Like, why is there a, I was going to say a cycle or a loop, but it's not always the same. But they are variations on a theme. So why do societies and civilizations keep following a similar pattern?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and one a lot of archaeologists and anthropologists are very interested in answering. And I think, this is sort of a boring answer, but I think it really depends on the place in the society. Like in ancient Egypt, for example, ideologically, it was very concerned with unity and balance, and like this concept called mot, which was like, you sort of had it individually and the society had it as a whole, and sort of restoring that balance was ideologically, religiously, like really key. So I think like once like the climate was um, went back to like quote unquote normal, like the Nile floods were more predictable, and you did start getting these huge surpluses again. Like there was sort of a, like I would say there was probably like quite an ideological, um, pull towards some kind of more unified uh, society again. I don't think that necessarily happens everywhere. Like the another sort of iconic collapse that I talk about in the book is the classic Maya, who also had not a unified state or empire, but a bunch of different kingdoms that had sort of similarly divinely like uh, divinely sort of ordained dynasties and monarchies that controlled um, you know everything basically, and they were all kind of interconnected in this web of sort of independent kingdoms, but they were all kind of marrying each other and fighting with each other, and these alliances and feuds were really complex and fascinating in and of themselves, actually. And when that ended, when people, the classic Maya collapse was really like an end of it, gets sort of cast as like, everybody died, everybody, like, they disappeared from these cities in the jungle, but really it was like, they decided that monarchies weren't working for them anymore. They left the places that sort of needed, it's hard to live in it's hard to keep up a palace if there's no king. Like, why would you, like, there's better things to do. And so people would move and sort of free form. And when the Europeans arrived, what was it, like 400 or 500 years after the classic Maya collapse had ended, there was still like thriving Maya society, but they had never gone back to something as hierarchical and as, like a monarchy system. It was more about confederations and smaller settlements, and and that presumably at some point would have ended as well, if colonialism hadn't happened. Like, that's hard to say how it all would have played out without that interference. But I think so. It's not quite, I think coming at it from our societies, which are so hierarchical and unequal and centralized, again, that's not without its benefits, like, there's a reason that we do this. But it's easy to see that pattern in the past and throughout the history of archaeology, which isn't really all that long as kind of a scientific endeavor, only about 150 years. Like, archaeologists have been most interested in those questions of
Mm-hmm.
centralization and complexity. And so I think part of it is that we have this sense that people keep coming back to this hierarchical organization of society. But in some senses, I think that is possibly um, just the societies that we know about, like, those are the societies
Mm-hmm.
that are most interesting to us because they most resemble the societies that we happen to develop. They leave behind things that are easy to find, easy to study: pyramids, monuments, huge temples, cities, like, and people who did things differently are a lot harder to find. It's not impossible, and archaeologists are certainly increasingly interested in this. But I think partially like the sense of inevitability or pattern is just kind of like what the science itself has like given us to work with. And I think there's a tremendous amount of material that is still out there to be explored and discovered and reinterpreted. And so I think there's a lot of possibilities in the past that we miss too.
I'm not a historian, but when I talk to historian, there seems to be, at least two competing theories about and one of them is the grand forces of history. There's overarching narratives or themes that you can really draw parallels between different societies, or that that individual actors are constrained by the forces of history, and that's why the study is so valuable, because it is broadly applicable. And I've spoken with others who essentially say history is just one damn thing after another, although they say that somewhat more eloquently. And what they mean by that, to my best understanding, is that so much of what happens in the world is contingent or random, right? There's always going to be people who are happy with a particular government, and there's always going to be people that are not happy. And which one is dominant is sometimes just a confluence of events that, if it didn't happen in exactly that way, it wouldn't have had any impact. But because it was at the right place at the right time, it had an enormous impact, even though it was kind of random. Or there's just contingent things about or quirks about the geography, or a particular cultural element that turned out to be really important that couldn't have been foreseen, and thus it's interesting to study history and to know the particulars of what happened in each time and place, but you can't draw any grand conclusions from it. So I imagine that those are also relevant to the study and theory of archaeology. And I'm curious, which camp do you fall under? Because you kind of had elements of both in your last response to me. So I'm curious.
Yeah, I think, partially that's because I'm a journalist and not and a writer and not an archaeologist or a historian, so I don't have to
Okay. Well,
be
I'm still
so
interested in your opinion.
so, uh, tied to one kind of like trend in the field. But I do think, I think sometimes the kind of like one thing after another, we can't like there's nothing, everything was totally random. Like that is um I think that can go a little far, that it's like there's no point in understanding what did happen. There's no, nothing can really come out of like cross-cultural comparisons. I don't think that that's I don't want to go that far. Like I'm not sure
Mhm.
that random is the word I would use here for how I view the past and think about it when I'm writing about it and researching it. But I would say that something that this, that I really thought a lot about while doing the book, and I think the book was really taught me, was that none of these, like, history is also not inevitable. Like, it's not predetermined. The people who experienced, I was thinking about people who are experiencing, you know, for them, unprecedented moments of disruption and uncertainty. They did not know how it was going to turn out, and just like we don't know how anything's going to turn out. And so, sort of trying to get into that emotional experience of experiencing, of living through history while you're, while it's happening, I think it's really important to, for me anyway, to like, to just try to keep in mind that, like, just because it did happen one way doesn't mean that it had to have happened that way. And there's a lot of opportunities and possibilities that never got explored for, whatever, yeah, kind of random accidents. And so I think holding kind of both of those views in tension is fruitful and interesting and important. Like, this sense that, yeah, nothing, that history is not predetermined, it's not inevitable. The people who were doing it and living through it did not know the future, did not look at it from the same perspective that we have looking back on it. And at the same time, there are, as you said, sort of certain patterns and um, things that can be learned, mistakes that were made, that we can say, oh, we wish, things that we wish hadn't have happened but did. And so I think that having sort of a middle road is important. But for me, it's like, I think for a lot of people who are just kind of interested in history or archaeology but haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, the draw of inevitability is really, really powerful. And I think it's important to sort of fight back against that in my own thinking and my own writing, and
Mhm.
just sort of try to bring it back to, like, what did this feel like when it was happening in the present, and what are all the things that could have happened, and why didn't they? It's like, it's that question then becomes more interesting as well. Like, if it wasn't inevitable, why did it happen the way it did? And sometimes that is random accident. Sometimes, like, there's a bunch of ways to interpret it. But I think I like having both in my mind. But yeah, the lack of inevitability is really key for me.
Yeah, I mean, the way I tend to think of it is that if you're a leader, you do face very real constraints,
Mhm.
right? Like, if you're in a war, because we don't study peacetime that might last centuries. We study the decade of war in in a particular era's history. That's definitely a bias that our academia has. But a leader has constraints. How much food is your society producing? How large and how well trained is your army? And you can't just go marching, toe to toe with a larger, better equipped, better trained army and expect to win. But that doesn't mean that that utter defeat is your only option. There are. I mean, I tend to think of it in terms of you do face genuine constraints because of the historical circumstances that brought you to a particular point. But there's never just one option. There's always a choice to be made, even if your ideal choice, your preferred option, may not be practical or available to you. I do want to close our conversation with coming it back to the contemporary world, but I want to come back. I want to stay in the past, and it's something that you mentioned a few moments ago, which was when the remaining Mayan civilization was contacted by the Spanish. Roughly 530 or so years ago. Now, I have read a fair amount of on this, so I'd like to think that I wanted to think that I was reasonably well informed, but your account was very different. What there's the dominant thread that I thought what happened is that the Spanish brought diseases with them that because of their geographic isolation, the people living in the Americas had not been exposed to it all and were therefore quite vulnerable to. And so that by the time the Spanish actually reached the cities of the Mayan civilization that was there, like over half of the population had already been wiped out, which is why such a very small band of Spanish people were able to essentially conquer some of the largest cities. But that's not a particularly accurate view, given what I just read in Apocalypse. So I'm better informed now, and could you better inform our listeners who I suspect would have similar views that I have just espoused, and that may not be reflected in or may not accurately reflect what actually happened to the best of our current knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, the colonialism, I think European colonialism beginning around 500 years ago is, in my telling and to my thinking, the worst apocalypse that humans have ever experienced and sort of inflicted on each other in this case. But because we still live in the world that apocalypse created, there's so much kind of, excuse me, because we still live in the world that apocalypse created, and we really haven't been able to recover from it and think creatively about what worked and what didn't, and what all these other things that people in past apocalypses have been able to do. We've really maintained the structures and ideologies and expectations of the apocalypse itself. It's so big, it's hard to see now. And I think part of that unfortunate story is the way that it's kind of narrowed our historical imagination and how we see these events at the beginning. We sort of think, oh, well, it reshaped the world so completely and dramatically, that must have happened immediately. It must have been inevitable. There was no other way through this contact between kind of quote unquote old and new world. And I think, to a certain extent, there are what you say about disease, there is a certain amount of truth to the epidemic diseases. Of course, these events were really devastating to many, many indigenous communities for centuries. But that kind of 4 centuries is really key. Like this is not, it was not a immediate process. These the epidemics especially sort of led to a lot of reorganization and reimagination, like both, for everyone. Like it's not like the indigenous people are the only ones dying of smallpox in the Americas. Like Europeans died all the time as well. And, and I think in
Mm-hmm.
indigenous people, once they're living under colonial regimes and being exploited by them and oppressed by them and enslaved, you know, the same way that we see kind of social determinants of health today, and how inequality, you know, uh, in our most immediate example, like really affected the course of the COVID pandemic, both globally and locally. Um, these kind of social forces made those diseases a lot worse, and had and harder to recover from, both individually and kind of societally. And so I think, going back to thinking about the Maya or the Aztecs who are in Mexico City, which is like the colonial story I write the most about in the book, and the sense of like trying to go back to like what this felt like to the people who were living through it and making decisions during it and reacting to opportunities and challenges that were rising, like um, the Europeans, the Spanish, and various other people from the Africa and the Caribbean, like they lived in Tenochtitlan, Mexico City now for 8 months, like, and it's like, what was that like? That's to me the most interesting part of the story, like not just like jumping past all of that negotiation and relationships and like conversations and like hours spent together and like meals shared, and how are people getting to know each other, and what were people, how is this encounter like changing everybody's sense of the world that they lived in. And it's like to just jump to the end of the story, which is like the conquest of Tenochtitlan by um, by Spain, is like really giving short shrift to like the most interesting part of all of this, I think. And in terms of the Maya, like there were Maya capitals that survived as independent societies for centuries after European contact, like there, because it was so decentralized, like traditionally, and especially after the classic collapse. Um, there were cities that were like well into the 1600s, end of the 1600s, beginning of the 1700s, almost 200 years after the Spanish had first arrived in Yucatan, were still, living a fully indigenous, like not exactly pre-colonial life, but like they just said no thank you to the to this new way of doing things, and did their own thing for centuries. And because we're like so um convinced that this story was inevitable and had to be over so fast, we just like don't talk about that. It's not that it didn't happen, it's just that we don't see it, or we sort of collapse what
Mm-hmm.
happened in Tenochtitlan in the 1520s with what happened in California in the 1840s. It's like that's a tremendous time difference, right? And so like, and what happened in between? And I think like when we sort of when we jump straight to the end of the story as though that were the only important part, I think we miss the meaning of the story. We miss all these other possible meanings that we could learn, like we could take away. And we just miss the most interesting part. Like it turns into just like this boring march through time, where like the society we have now is a society that we have to have, that we always had to have, that we have to preserve at any cost. And I think like that
Right.
way, for me, like that way of seeing not only apocalypses, but history itself is just like, no, there's a lot of possibilities here. And we're not even trapped in the one that we ended up with today.
That reminds me of a fairly famous quotation from Margaret Thatcher, former PM of Britain, who said
Mhm.
that there is no alternative. She wanted to pursue her agenda because she's a politician, and like that's fine, that's what politicians do. But rather than have a we can do this or that or the other thing, and let's have a reasoned debate about the alternatives and then choose the best one. She took her preferred one and said there is no alternative, and rammed it through. And a corollary of that, which she said at the same time, is that there's no such thing as society, right? We are all autonomous, independent individuals, and that we need to have individual freedom. So society is just a mirage, or at best a agglomeration of individuals making choices, and then we aggregate, and that aggregation is society. But it doesn't actually exist. I'm not sure that I agree with her, but that's it. That kind of what you're
Mhm.
saying brings that to mind, where if we look at history just as a series of linear events, and because we're here right now, it was inevitable that we would get to this point, and this is the only
Mhm.
structure or type of civilization that
Yeah.
is possible from this point onward. And that actually brings me to the contemporary world. And your last chapter in the book, and you've obviously thought about this. I will confess that I share your view that I think that uh, an apocalypse, as you have defined it, um, is quite possible, and that in my lifetime, and I've been around for over half a century now, right? And so, I'm hoping to have several decades of vibrant life yet, and I used to think that climate change would be a significant issue that my grandchildren would have to face, um, and then I learned that no, it's probably going to be something that my children are going to have to address, which was very concerning. And now I genuinely believe that
Mhm.
it's upon us now, and that it's something that we have to deal with, or that I have to deal with if I want my remaining time on on this planet to be uh, pleasurable, or lacking in genuine hardship and widespread catastrophe. Right? And so, how what is your perspective on not necessarily as individuals, but as communities and as countries or nation states? Um, Rahm Emanuel, who was the former mayor of Chicago and national politician, said you should never let a serious crisis go to waste. I think I think it's fair to say that we're facing a crisis, and that our reactions so far seem to be exacerbating rather than ameliorating
Mhm.
its worst effects. So, what can we do collectively, as communities, as countries, to navigate the just like as a recession, you never know if you're in one until it's over. Uh, this apocalypse that we might be entering or already in the midst of.
Yeah, I mean, it's the question of our time, right? And the one we will, yeah, sort of, I agree with you that, climate change especially has sort of gotten the time horizon has shortened. It's been like, oh, it was going to be something in the future. Now it's something in the present. Pandemic. Well, the and I think what apocalypses do, in addition to all the bad things that happen, the suffering and the dying and the fear and the having to move and, like truly scary things that none of us wish for our lives. Like what I do think genuinely that they've always done, and like their true power, is that they do expose the alternatives. They do present, they present they make it obvious that that position, that there is no alternative, was never true. And it makes it so you can see things, impossible things that you thought were absolutely impossible suddenly overnight are possible, and like you really, I think, sort of grabbing those opportunities is really important. But for me, like especially maybe writing this so intensely during the pandemic. Like what I ended up feeling like was like there's so much fear of change, which is of course natural, like both for individuals and for societies. Like I'd hate it
Mhm.
too, like nobody likes it. But this sense that like we have arrived, and I don't think people often even know that this is sort of the view of history and society that they've um, learned through school and just through media and the way we all talk about this stuff, like that we've kind of absorbed this idea that like we've like had this history is this like inevitable march of progress towards this pinnacle where we are now, and this is the best human life has ever been and maybe is ever going to get. And like now when these apocalypses strike, like there's nowhere to go but down, basically. And I think like that's sort of the sense of the progress of history that many of us have absorbed and live with, and kind of subconsciously even think is true. And I think writing the book made me realize that that's not true at all. Like there's so many, like not only did we not have to end up here, and there's so many ways, as you say, that like the way we've decided to structure our society has caused some of our coming apocalypses, made them worse, prolonged them, whatever. Like the reasons we got into this mess, like that we don't have to continue doing them. But I also genuinely think that to sort of be able to, it's not just a matter of being like, oh well, like uh I don't know, colonialism didn't work out. Like let's just turn on a dime and do something different. It's like you really have to um have the time and space, like societally, to like grieve what's been lost and mourn it, and recognize what is happening, and recognize the losses that we are experiencing, and the fear and the uncertainty and how hard that is. And I think that's a lot, in countries, I'm from the US, but I live in Mexico City and have for a long time. And, I saw a real difference in terms of like the US just could not deal with the kind of psychology of quarantine and the pandemic. And it was a lot about like suppressing this sense of that anything could intrude on my individual life, that I could have a responsibility to a larger community, that I would be asked to do something inconvenient for the benefit of all, or that, I could do everything quote unquote right, and I could still, die of a horrifying and terrifying disease, and like that is truly horrible. But, I think that the kind of suppression of that, those emotions, the denial of that reality, like really set, like the countries that did that, the communities that did that, really set themselves up for something, to not really be able to recover from the experience, because they were really never able to process it. And so I think, that's also something that, it's not just like a matter of tomorrow, like changing the entire way we structure our countries and societies. Is like something is really being lost here. This is really a scary and uncertain time. And I think, like, as I said at the beginning, kind of writing the book helped me look more directly at what is happening. And I think being able to do that, being able to talk about it, not needing to turn away so quickly, like that's what enables the recovery, actually. Like we need, and what I think in the case of colonialism, we've been like all forced to suppress the violence, and that continues today. We just like can't acknowledge it or see it, and that makes it sort of impossible to move beyond, and or to just, yeah, to repair in any way. And I think, with our coming apocalypses, we do have a chance to do things differently. We do have a chance to say, yes, okay, these are the things that weren't working for us. These are what got us into this mess. Like, how do we want to collectively move forward into a future that works better for the circumstances we find ourselves in and the ones we want to build. But I think if we just like try to suppress the fear and the grief, like that doesn't get us anywhere good. Like that's the first step, I think, for me.
Are there any examples of societies, like anywhere at any time, that have gone through this process without an external crisis, without experiencing an apocalypse of some kind?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of times in history. I mean, I didn't like they didn't make it into the book because they weren't apocalyptic, but things are
Mm-hmm.
constantly changing. There's constantly climate change. Like the kind of there's a lot of times and like the going back to the Old Kingdom Egypt example, the droughts had been worsening for quite a long time, decades before there were any kind of political or social fractures, and like that it sort of it count, there's like the kind of society, it has to hit the society at just the right point that it's already kind of showing its weak points. um, but I also think one example that has really stuck with me, that's sort of a small one in the book but ties into what you were talking about with the epidemic diseases of colonialism, which again were certainly real, but didn't affect all indigenous communities in the same way, was there was this was recorded upon contact with Europeans in California, and I think around the time of the gold rush, so 1850s, maybe a little later. But the communities the settlers encountered talked about having, a generation or two before, had been struck by a horrifying new disease, which presumably was smallpox or some other kind of epidemic disease that came out of, indigenous people fleeing from the missions in California, and would, unfortunately take some of these microbes with them as they sought shelter with communities that hadn't been affected yet. And so this was a case where the disease did arrive before the colonial structures. Like this was a group near Yosemite today. And, 30% of people died in this event, like horrible. These are small communities, but they had a way of dealing with historically. This is quite an unstable geological landscape. There are volcanic eruptions, there are earthquakes, there's like fires, there's all sorts of things that can happen to a community that can challenge it. And so they had a long tradition of saying, okay, that when something bad like this happens to us and threatens to our survival, we move in with our neighbors, and we recover with them. We intermarry, we live with them as long as it takes. And then when we feel like we're back on our feet, we sort of separate again and become our own community. And they'd presumably done this who knows how many times over centuries or millennia. And that's what they did when the smallpox epidemic arrived. And so when the Europeans did, and they had contact with the actual colonial structure and settlers and newly forming state, they had already recovered from this smallpox epidemic in a way that they had kept them connected to their long standing traditions, enabled them to continue to be a refuge for people fleeing the violence and oppressions, especially of the mission system, and then the gold rush that was increasing, and contact between your settlers, I guess they were Americans at this point, and indigenous people. And I think like that sense that like bad things do happen, they will happen, they will impact societies, but like we can we can recover. Like we have long traditions of being able to really look at what's happening and decide what to do next, and decide what we need to do to recover. And I think that that's kind of the sense that that's what this like kind of inevitability of history has taken away from us, the sense that like if something goes wrong, there is no alternative, there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do next, it's just all going, it all disintegrates into nothingness, and there's no future. And it's like there is always a future, and like we always do have choices and ways of reacting to what happened. But I think like, yeah, just being able to like confront the reality of and the gravity of these events is sort of key to figuring out what to do next. But I think we have a long human tradition of being able to do it. So that is what makes me optimistic.
Not only is there post-apocalyptic society, but it is not a Mad Max wasteland,
No,
or it doesn't have to
it
be.
doesn't have to be, at the
Right.
very least.
Well, okay. Well, on that note, I think I want to say thank you very much, Lizzie Wade, author of Apocalypse. This has been a fabulous conversation. Thank you for being my guest today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review and showing your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, on Facebook, and you can follow us on Blue Sky at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblatt. See you next time.